In 1990, a woman was admitted to a psychiatric ward in Edinburgh. She told her doctors, calmly and with complete conviction, that she had died several weeks earlier. She was not confused. She was not agitated. She was simply explaining what she believed to be true. When doctors pointed out that she was breathing, speaking, and sitting in front of them, she acknowledged all of this, and then she explained that none of it changed anything, because she was already dead. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented clinical case, one of fewer than a few hundred recorded in over a century of psychiatric literature. The condition is called Cotard Syndrome, sometimes referred to in medical writing as the walking corpse syndrome, and it raises a question that cuts to the heart of neuroscience. If the brain is the organ that tells us we are alive, what happens when that signal fails? Welcome to Case Zero, where we investigate the cases that left doctors, historians, and scientists without answers. According to documented medical literature, patients with this condition have insisted that their internal organs no longer exist, that their blood has disappeared, that their bodies are decaying from within, or that they themselves have ceased to exist altogether. To everyone around them, they appear physically alive. To themselves, they are already dead. The syndrome is extraordinarily rare. Because of its rarity, most psychiatrists will never encounter a single confirmed case during their careers. Researchers have instead relied on individual case reports collected across hospitals and psychiatric institutions over more than 100 years. These reports consistently describe a pattern. Some patients believe they have lost specific organs. Others insist they no longer possess blood. Some report that their heart has stopped. Others believe they have become immortal, not because of any extraordinary power, but because they believe they have already died and therefore cannot die again. Although the symptoms vary from case to case, they all share one defining feature. The patient no longer experiences themselves as a living human being. Doctors classify Cotard syndrome not as a separate psychiatric disease, but as a syndrome, a cluster of symptoms that can appear alongside several underlying neurological or psychiatric conditions. Medical literature has documented associations with severe depression, psychotic disorders, bipolar disorder, certain neurological illnesses, traumatic brain injury, and in rare cases, neurodegenerative diseases. The condition itself remains extraordinarily uncommon. The syndrome owes its name to one man, French neurologist Jules Cotard. In 1880, while presenting before the Société d'éco-psychologie in Paris, Cotard described a patient unlike any he had previously encountered. She would later become known in psychiatric history simply as Mademoiselle X. According to Cotard's published observations, the woman denied the existence of several parts of her own body. She stated that she had no brain, no nerves, no chest, no internal organs. She believed that only skin and bones remained. But perhaps even more remarkably, she believed she no longer required food, because she considered herself already dead. Medical records indicate that she refused to eat for extended periods. She also denied the possibility of natural death, believing that eternal damnation had already become her reality. Cotard referred to these beliefs as a form of délire des negations, a delusion of negation. His presentation immediately attracted attention among European psychiatrists, because it describes something profoundly different from previously recognized disorders. This was not merely sadness, nor confusion. It was the complete rejection of one's own existence. Over the decades that followed, psychiatrists across Europe began recognizing similar patients. Although each case differed in detail, the central belief remained astonishingly consistent. Patients denied their own existence. Some denied the existence of the outside world. Others insisted that everyone around them was already dead as well. Medical journals throughout the 20th century documented these extraordinary cases. With careful clinical language, researchers understood that beneath these impossible beliefs was a very real psychiatric illness. Jules Cotard described a delusion, but a delusion, by definition, cannot be argued away. To understand why, we need to look at the patients who came after Mademoiselle X and what their cases revealed about the brain itself. More than a century after Jules Cotard first described his patient, psychiatrists were still encountering people whose experiences seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The details differed, the ages differed, the countries differed. Yet the core belief remains strikingly similar. Somewhere deep within the brain, the patient's sense of being alive had become profoundly distorted. One of the most widely discussed modern cases appeared in medical literature in 2008. Neurologists and psychiatrists described a man referred to by the initials G.W. According to the published case report, the man developed severe depression following a traumatic accident. Over time, he became convinced that he had died from sepsis and that his brain no longer functioned. He repeatedly told doctors that there was no reason for him to eat. Dead people, he explained, did not need food. His conviction remained firm despite conversations with medical staff and repeated evidence that his body was functioning normally. To the clinicians treating him, the most remarkable feature was not the content of the belief, but the absolute certainty with which it was held. Doctors eventually succeeded in stabilizing the patient through psychiatric treatment. As his underlying depression improved, his belief that he was dead gradually weakened. This pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout the medical literature. Cotard syndrome rarely exists in isolation. Instead, physicians often observe it emerging during episodes of severe psychiatric illness, particularly major depressive disorder with psychotic features. In other patients, the syndrome has been associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or neurological diseases affecting the brain directly. These observations led researchers to an important conclusion. The bizarre belief itself is not the disease. It is a symptom produced by a much deeper disruption in how the brain processes reality. Another documented case from the early 2000s involved a woman admitted to hospital after insisting that she had already died. According to the clinical report, she explained that her internal organs had stopped functioning and that there was no point speaking with doctors because medicine could not help someone who no longer existed. Medical examinations found no evidence supporting these beliefs. Yet from her perspective, the conclusion felt entirely undeniable. Psychiatrists have long recognized that delusions are not simply incorrect ideas. They are experiences that feel entirely real to the individual. For someone experiencing Cotard syndrome, the evidence visible to everyone else never outweighs what their own brain is telling them. Doctors do not describe these patients as pretending, exaggerating, or misunderstanding reality. Medical literature consistently frames Cotard syndrome as a genuine psychiatric phenomenon, involving profoundly altered self-perception. Perhaps one of the most unusual documented cases came from the United Kingdom. A man suffering from severe depression became convinced that he had died, believing there was no longer any reason to remain in society. He reportedly traveled to a cemetery because he felt it was where he belonged. According to published accounts, he later explained that he preferred being among the dead because he believed he was one of them. For psychiatrists, this case demonstrated just how completely a nihilistic delusion can reshape a person's understanding of the world. When the brain accepts a false belief with complete certainty, every decision begins to follow that false reality. From the outside, the behavior appears irrational. From the patient's perspective, it is perfectly consistent. That consistency is one of the defining characteristics of psychiatric delusions. As more cases accumulated over decades, researchers began asking a different question. If these patients were physically alive, why did their brains insist otherwise? Advances in brain imaging offered the first clues. Although Cotard syndrome remains too rare for large clinical studies, several neurological investigations suggested abnormalities in brain regions involved in emotional processing, self-awareness, and the integration of sensory information. Researchers paid particular attention to networks linking the frontal lobes with limbic structures, responsible for emotion. These systems normally allow people to connect perception with emotional significance. For example, when you look into a mirror, you do not simply recognize a face. You also experience the deeply familiar feeling that the face belongs to you. Some neuroscientists have proposed that Cotard syndrome may involve a disruption of precisely this connection. The patient recognizes the physical body, but the emotional sense of ownership of being inside that body has somehow been altered. It is important to note that this remains a scientific hypothesis, supported by limited evidence rather than an established explanation. Because the syndrome is so uncommon, researchers continue to debate the precise neurological mechanisms involved. This idea becomes more intriguing when compared with another rare neurological condition. In Cotard Syndrome, patients recognize the appearance of someone close to them but believe that person has been replaced by an identical imposter. Researchers have suggested that both disorders may involve disruptions in how the brain combines recognition with emotional familiarity. In Cotard Syndrome, the disconnect affects other people. In Cotard Syndrome, it may affect the patient's own sense of existence. While these are clearly distinct disorders, comparing them has helped neuroscientists better understand how fragile our sense of identity may actually be. Most people assume that self-awareness is permanent, that the certainty of being alive is automatic. The documented cases of Cotard Syndrome suggest otherwise. If Cotard Syndrome is so rare, how do doctors recognize it? There is no blood test, brain scan that can confirm the diagnosis on its own. Instead, physicians rely on detailed psychiatric assessment, careful medical history, neurological examination, and the patient's own description of their experiences. Because the syndrome is considered a cluster of symptoms rather than a standalone disease, identifying its underlying cause is essential. Doctors first work to determine whether the delusion is associated with severe depression, a psychotic disorder, a neurological illness, medication effects, or another medical condition. Only then can treatment be directed toward the illness responsible for producing the syndrome. Although Cotard Syndrome is dramatic in its presentation, medical literature shows that many documented patients have improved after receiving appropriate treatment for the underlying condition. For patients experiencing severe depression with psychotic features, treatment may include antidepressant medications, antipsychotic medications, or a combination of both. Because Cotard Syndrome is so uncommon, there are no large clinical trials dedicated specifically to its treatment. Psychiatrists rely on evidence gathered from individual case reports and established treatments for the disorders with which the syndrome most commonly occurs. One treatment appears repeatedly throughout the medical literature: electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as ECT. For many people, the name immediately brings to mind outdated images from films, but modern ECT is very different from those portrayals. According to psychiatric guidelines, the procedure is performed under general anesthesia with muscle relaxants, allowing doctors to induce a carefully controlled seizure while the patient is unconscious. It is primarily reserved for severe psychiatric illnesses, particularly when symptoms are life-threatening or when other treatments have not been effective. Several published case reports describe patients with Cotard Syndrome experiencing substantial improvement after undergoing ECT, especially when the syndrome occurred alongside severe depression. Researchers emphasize that these reports involve individual patients rather than definitive proof that ECT is effective for every case. Nevertheless, it remains one of the most frequently described successful treatments in the medical literature surrounding this rare condition. Despite more than a century of research, many questions remain unanswered. Scientists still do not know exactly why only a tiny number of patients develop Cotard Syndrome, while millions of others experience depression, psychosis, or neurological illness without ever believing they are dead. The rarity of the disorder makes large-scale research extremely difficult. Most of what medicine knows today comes from carefully documented individual cases, collected over decades. Each new patient provides another piece of a puzzle that is still incomplete. For neuroscientists, Cotard Syndrome represents more than an unusual psychiatric curiosity. It offers a unique window into one of the greatest unanswered questions in all of neuroscience. How does the brain construct the feeling that we exist? Most of us never question our own existence. The experience feels immediate, automatic, effortless. Yet modern neuroscience suggests that this certainty is continuously generated by networks of neurons integrating sensation, memory, emotion, and self-awareness. When those networks function normally, the experience of being alive feels undeniable. When they do not, even that most fundamental certainty can begin to dissolve. Perhaps that is what makes Cotard Syndrome so remarkable. It does not simply alter what someone believes about the world, it alters the foundation upon which every other belief is built. The syndrome reminds us that our perception of reality is not a direct recording of the outside world. It is an interpretation, one that the brain is continuously constructing. Usually, that interpretation is remarkably accurate. Occasionally, it is not. The patients described in medical journals were not choosing their beliefs. According to the physicians who treated them, they experienced those beliefs as absolute reality. Their stories challenge one of our deepest assumptions, that the awareness of being alive is permanent and beyond question. Instead, they reveal how delicate that awareness may actually be, a complex biological process maintained every moment, without our conscious attention, one that most of us never notice, until we encounter the rare cases in which it disappears. For more than 140 years, physicians, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists have continued to study Cotard syndrome. Each documented case has expanded our understanding not only of a rare psychiatric disorder, but of the human mind itself. The syndrome demonstrates that our sense of self is not as fixed as it feels. It is something the brain must continually create, and in extraordinarily rare circumstances, that creation can fail. Here is what I keep returning to. These patients were not dreaming. They were awake, aware, and reasoning just from within a reality the rest of us couldn't access. Which raises one question worth leaving in the comments. If the brain constructs your sense of being alive every single moment, how certain can you really be that it's getting it right? Disclaimer: this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. All information presented is based on published historical records, academic research, and peer-reviewed literature. Viewer discretion is advised.